Doesn't that make so much more sense than the concept and idea that God just chooses unilaterally to damn people to hell before they do anything bad? I listened to just recently from the Founders Ministry, Tom Askell, in a question answer, and they're brought up this very passage. Listen for yourself when he makes the same exact point.
Trust him, and any kind of fleshliness that would rise up in us to say, well, who is he to find fault with me? The answer comes. You're not getting the answer to this. You're just, who are you, a man, to answer back to God? Remember who you are. It's humility and submission. Other pastoral implications?
Yeah, and let me underscore it too with just the important doctrinal significance of that Romans 9 passage. That argument that Paul anticipates, those questions, make no sense if God's eternal decree is not true. If God's not absolutely sovereign, then those protests make no sense. Nobody would ever question that. So it's only in the context of what we're talking about and God's providence with his decree being infallible, immutable, it will come to pass, being real. And the pastoral implication.
Okay, so what's Tom Askell arguing there? It doesn't make any sense for Paul to even ask the question, is there unrighteousness with God, if he's not confronting Calvinism, because Calvinism intuitively, as even Sproul testified earlier in this chapter, it intuitively, baked within us, is intuitively unjust of God to do what he does, to reprobate most of humanity before they're ever born, before they do anything good or bad. That's intuitively unjust. So the fact that he's raising the question, does this make God unjust, proves he must be promoting Calvinism. Makes sense, right? I used to make this argument as a Calvinist. The fact that he's raising the objection, does this make God unjust, proves that he must be teaching something that makes God look unjust. And what makes God look more unjust than Calvinism? Nothing. There's nothing I can imagine that would make God look more unjust than the claims of Calvinistic reprobation. The concept of double predestination. God has predestined people like Esau to eternal hell before he did anything good or bad, and he has predestined people like Jacob to eternal heaven before he's done anything good or bad. And that seems intuitively unjust, even by Sproul's own estimation, where he was dragged kicking and screaming into the doctrines against his conscience, he even says, because baked in within all of us, we are all semi-Pelagians from birth, he says. Remember all that from the last episode? So he even admits that even among Christians, intuitively, we believe this makes God unjust, which proves, in their mind at least, that must be what Paul's teaching, because Calvinism is unjust. And it can't be possible that there's any other charge of injustice that could be in the mind of Paul except that which Calvinists insist it must be, right? I'm just saying, Calvinists, back away for a second and ask yourself the question, could there possibly be another charge of injustice in mind here? Is it even possible? Have you even entertained another possible interlocutor? Have you even considered other ways of interpreting this text? Or have you just listened to people like Sproul and Piper and MacArthur and these others bring up this point and go, oh yeah, that must, and again, I'm talking about myself here because this is what I did when I was in my 20s. I just heard MacArthur make that point. I heard Ernie Reisinger, I believe his name was, at the Founders Conference when I was a part of the Founders Ministry, making this very point in a sermon, of which he got a standing ovation for at the very end. And he made this very point. The fact that the interlocutor is bringing up the charge of injustice with God proves Calvinism must be on the lips of the apostle, he said. Because what other doctrine brings up that charge except the claim of a Calvinist? Right? So let's back off and consider. I put this little document together to help us. I'm trying to be as clear as I possibly can because I don't want anybody to accuse me of not being clear of anything else, okay? Is God unrighteous if he blank? Okay? Is God unrighteous if he works Calvinistically, you might say? Is God unrighteous if he, and you could put anything in that blank. I mean, you could think of the most heinous thing. Is God unrighteous if he tortures infants for his own whimsical pleasure? And we would all, I think even Calvinists would say, no, God obviously wouldn't never do that. That would be unjust, and God wouldn't do it. Is it unjust if God lies and is morally evil? Well, of course, that would be unrighteous. We would say that would be unrighteous. But what can you put in that blank there? Okay? And what is in the blank in the mind of Paul when he's answering this objection, when he's answering this problem? There's two possible solutions. Some of you haven't even considered both possibilities. You've only considered the one, and therefore you sided with Calvinists. Okay, here's option one. Here's the Calvinist option. Okay, is God unrighteous if he reprobates much of humanity to hell before they do anything good or bad? Is that unrighteous for God to damn people to hell before they do anything bad and without regard to the bad they end up doing? Because ultimately, if you're using a consistent hermeneutic, that's basically the concept of double predestination is basically the issue that's raised in the mind of the interlocutor, at least from the Calvinistic vantage point, that is it unrighteous if he condemns Esau to hell before he's done anything good or bad? Is that unrighteous? Well, I would say yes, it is unrighteous because it flies in the face of many Old Testament and New Testament passages about what is right and good. Do not condemn a person who's innocent. You don't take somebody who hadn't done anything bad and condemn them to be punished. And you certainly wouldn't condemn somebody to be punished that you yourself are somehow, even through secondary means, controlling their thoughts, behaviors, and actions. That is demonstrably unjust and unrighteous. But, well, the apostle's raising the question of injustice, therefore Calvinism must be right and Paul must be a Calvinist. And that's why he's raising this objection. Or could it be another option? What's option two? Let's look at it. Is God unrighteous if he judicially hardens Israel so as to bring about salvation for the Gentiles? Doesn't that fit just a little bit better into the narrative of Romans 9 through 11? Think about this. You ask yourself, okay, what do you mean by judicially harden? Judicially harden is the same thing that has to do with Pharaoh. And this is why we draw the parallel, as do many commentators, between Pharaoh and Israel. Pharaoh was hardened by God to bring about the first Passover. Israel is being hardened by God to bring about the second Passover. What is judicial hardening? Well, to understand that, you need to understand what self-hardening is. Self-hardening is when, by your own free will actions, you could have done otherwise, you suppress the truth and unrighteousness, and you continually suppress the truth and unrighteousness. You close your eyes, spiritual eyes, to the truth so that you no longer can see, hear, understand, and turn so as to be forgiven. Acts 28, verses 23 through 28, right? So we understand there is a self-hardening that takes place, and Israel is not born hardened. They're not born unable to believe, but they are cut off because of their unbelief. And so, in other words, they're not unilaterally just cut off for no apparent reason. They're cut off because they've refused to believe. And what does cut off mean? Well, the light came to them. They refused the light. He persisted with them, held out his hands to them all day long, was patient with them, but God will not contend with men forever, the Bible says. And so what does he do eventually? He takes the light and says, okay, well, if you don't want it, I'm going to take it from you and I'm going to give it to the Gentiles. So I'm going to cut you off. I'm going to harden you in your rebellion, send you a spirit of stupor, speak to you in parabolic riddles so that you don't really understand what's going on with your own Messiah right in front of your eyes. And I'm going to use you in your rebellion to cry out, crucify him, so that you will bring about redemption for the world, so that all the families of the world would be blessed even through your unrighteousness. And who would say, foul, that's wrong, how dare you? Who would say that to Paul? Every Israelite in his audience who is hardened and doesn't believe he's of the Messiah, right? Could that not be the objector in the mind of Paul, the hardened Israelite in his rebellion, who's now being used by the God of Israel to bring in dirty barbarian Gentiles who haven't kept the law a day in their life, who've never been circumcised, who did not meticulously follow all the cleansing rites and rituals of the Old Testament covenant? And these people are getting saved by my God because they believe in this Jesus of Nazareth, this carpenter's kid? Could that not be a charge of unrighteousness in the mind of Paul? Doesn't that make so much more sense than the concept and idea that God just chooses unilaterally to damn people to hell before they do anything bad? Both of them are charges of unrighteousness. And if you can't see that, then I can't help you. But you've got to see that both are charges of unrighteousness in the mind of Paul. Which one is he actually answering? Look at the context. Look what he goes on to say in chapters 10 and 11 when he talks about these same Jews who are stumbling, not stumbling beyond recovery. When he says these same ones who have been cut off could be grafted back in if they leave their unbelief. Does that sound like a reprobate destined for hell before he's ever born? Of course not. The hardened Israelites aren't the reprobate of Calvinism in Romans 9. How do we know? Because they could be grafted back in if they leave their unbelief in chapter 11, and they haven't stumbled beyond recovery. You don't have to go very far to see Calvinism's interpretation of Romans 9 just doesn't play out. It does not work. And whenever you understand that the unrighteousness in the mind of the apostle is the unrighteousness being introduced by the hardened Jew, not a first century Arminian, then all of the Calvinism apologetic just disappears. There's no apologetics for Calvinism. What is apologetics? A defense for the claims of the Calvinistic system. That intuitive belief that says this is wrong is not answered in Romans 9 once you understand who the actual interlocutor is. Now, you say, has this objection been brought up before? Like I mentioned before, Romans chapter 3, this same interlocutor is introduced. In chapter 2, actually, end of chapter 2 is when he is introduced. And he goes on to chapter 3, and he says, then what advantage is there being a Jew? If anyone can be saved by grace through faith, if salvation is brought to any nation from any people through faith, then what benefit is to be an Israelite? And what's Paul's answer? Much in every way. Because what is the value of circumcision? To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with what? The oracles of God. That's verse 4 and 5 of Romans 9, by the way. The law, the prophets, the message, the messenger, this is from Israel. They are entrusted with the oracles of God. They are Israel, which is, like I said in our last episode, Israel is from the root for the prince. And the prince was known as the mouthpiece for the king, right? He spoke for the king. The king would not oftentimes grant or grace the subjects with his presence, so he would send his son as to bring the oracles, to bring the message. And so the prince, Israel, is the mouthpiece for God. That's what they're chosen for. But what if his mouthpiece is unfaithful? What if his prince, what if that mouthpiece, what if it's unfaithful? What if it doesn't do what it's said to do? What if, like Jonah, it's said to go to Nineveh and they get up on a ship and they sail to Tarsus? Is God going to fail? Is God's promises not going to be fulfilled? Does their unfaithfulness, does their faithlessness or unfaithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means, he goes on to argue. And look at verse 5. Here's the exact question that you see in Romans 9. If our unrighteousness, he's speaking of the Jews, if the Jews' unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict his wrath upon us? This is a human argument. It's almost like saying, who are you, O man, to talk back to God? If he wants to use you in your unrighteousness to cry out, crucify him so as to bring redemption for the world, who are you to talk back to God? That's the interlocutor in the mind of Paul. And once you get that Calvinism, you just go, oh, I don't need Calvinism anymore. I don't have to swallow that basketball-sized pill and just stuff it down my throat saying, well, I guess if the Bible teaches it, I have to believe God reprobates people before they do anything bad. And he just unilaterally picks some people for destruction before they ever do anything. And I just have to accept it. I love people that apparently he doesn't love. I would give myself up for their salvation like Paul's willing to do. Like if it was my child, for example, that was reprobated, I'd give up my life and my salvation for my child, but Jesus wouldn't. Instead of accepting that very difficult pill, why not even consider this as an option for you? Why isn't men like Sproul even addressing this as a possible option? Why isn't people like Tom Askell in that answered question program just insisting the only rational way in which you can understand his objections is if he's objecting to Calvinism? There's no other. It's almost as if he's not even considered what I have said here. It's almost as if it's not even dawned on him that there could be another objector besides the first century synergists, i.e. Arminian, i.e. non-Calvinist, objecting. And I'm just saying, brothers and sisters, we've got to do better than what the Calvinists are offering for us. And this is the best of the best from R.C. Sproul in his exposition.